The thermometer outside read 42 degrees below zero, and the wind was tearing Vernon Holcomb's chimney apart stone by stone. But 30 feet away, buried under 6 feet of snow and earth, Tobias Erdmann sat in his shirt sleeves, watching his daughter play on a warm dirt floor. What happened in the 18 months before that moment would change how settlers built their homes across the entire Dakota Territory, and the technique Tobias discovered would save more than 40 lives during the worst blizzard in American history. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier ingenuity move you, hit that subscribe button, because what we're covering tomorrow might be the most unbelievable survival innovation you've ever heard. Spring came late to Dakota Territory in 1887. Snow still covered the ground in early April, and the wind carried the kind of cold that made men question why they'd ever left civilization. Tobias Erdmann rode toward the cabin he shared with his younger brother Leander, returning from a 3-day trip to the settlement at Deadwood for supplies. He'd left Leander with enough firewood to last a week. The cabin should have shown smoke from the chimney. It didn't. Tobias knew something was wrong before he dismounted. The door hung partially open, snow drifted across the threshold, and the silence was absolute. No smoke meant no fire. No fire in April in Dakota Territory meant trouble. He tied his horse and approached slowly, though he already understood what he would find inside. Leander was sitting in the chair near the cold fireplace, still wrapped in both blankets they owned, frozen solid. He'd been dead at least 2 days, probably longer. The firewood was stacked neatly against the wall, untouched after Tobias had left. The fireplace held ashes from the last fire, cold and gray. Tobias stood in the doorway trying to understand what had happened. His brother hadn't frozen because he lacked wood or the knowledge to build a fire. Leander had survived 6 Dakota winters. He knew cold. He knew survival. But something about this cabin, this structure they'd built with their own hands 2 years earlier, had failed him. Tobias walked around the small interior looking for answers. The gaps between the logs were chinked with mud and moss, standard construction. The gaps had widened over 2 winters of freezing and thawing. Wind came through in a dozen places. The door fit poorly in its frame. They'd known this. They'd planned to fix it come spring. Spring had come too late for Leander. Tobias examined his brother more carefully, looking for signs of what had killed him beyond the obvious cold. Leander's hands were positioned as if he'd been trying to pull the blankets tighter. His face showed no injury, no sign of illness. He had simply gotten cold and stayed cold until the cold stopped him. The fireplace held enough ash to suggest Leander had maintained a fire for some time. After Tobias left, then something had changed. Tobias looked at the wood pile again, full, untouched for days. That meant Leander had stopped feeding the fire while wood was still available. Why would a man freeze to death with firewood within reach? The answer came slowly. Exhaustion. Leander had burned wood constantly trying to heat a cabin that couldn't hold heat. Eventually, exhausted from maintaining the fire, he'd stopped, wrapped himself in blankets, sat down to rest. The cold had taken him while he rested. Tobias stepped outside into the weak April sunlight and looked at the cabin from a distance. Solid logs, good roof, proper chimney. By every standard definition, this was adequate shelter. Adequate had killed his brother. Tobias spent that first night in the cabin with Leander's body, unable to sleep, studying the structure that had failed them. He lit a fire in the fireplace and watched how quickly the heat disappeared. Within 20 minutes of building a substantial fire, he could feel cold air moving across the floor. The heat went straight up the chimney. What little warmth spread into the room was immediately attacked by cold air seeping through the walls. He walked the perimeter, holding his hand near the log joints. Every seam leaked. The mud chinking had dried and cracked over 2 winters. In some places, he could see daylight through gaps. This wasn't unusual. Every cabin on the frontier had the same problems. Men accepted it as the nature of log construction. You built a big fire and stayed close to it. That was survival. But Leander had built big fires. The ash pile proved it. He'd burned wood constantly, and it hadn't been enough. Tobias did calculations in his head. A fire hot enough to warm this cabin required feeding every 30 to 40 minutes. Through the night, that meant waking repeatedly to add wood. A man could do that for a few nights, a week maybe, but exhaustion accumulated. Eventually, you slept too long. The fire died. The cold won. Tobias examined the walls more carefully. The logs were 8 to 10 inches in diameter, chinked with a 3-inch layer of mud and moss between them. That meant the effective wall thickness was roughly 11 to 13 inches of material that was supposed to stop cold air. But the logs themselves conducted cold. Wood was better than metal, but it still transferred temperature, and the chinking was porous, cracked, failing. He thought about the winters he'd survived in this cabin. They'd always been cold. He'd accepted that as normal. Wake up with frost on the inside walls, keep the fire going, wear heavy clothes indoors. That was frontier life. But now, looking at his brother's frozen body, Tobias saw it differently. They hadn't been surviving despite the cabin. They'd been surviving despite the cabin's failures through constant effort and luck. The next morning, Tobias began the work of burying Leander. The ground was still partially frozen, making digging difficult. He selected a spot on the hillside above the creek where they'd sometimes sat in the evenings. The grave took most of the day to dig. 4 feet down, Tobias noticed something that stopped him mid-swing with the shovel. His hands were warm. The air temperature was barely above freezing. The wind was constant and cold. But his hands, buried in the earth at the bottom of this grave, were warm. Not hot, but noticeably warmer than the air. He knelt and pressed his palm against the soil at the bottom of the grave. The earth was perhaps 50 degrees when the surface was 32. Tobias had noticed this before when digging root cellars or fence posts. Deep earth stayed warm. He'd never thought about why or what it meant. Now, kneeling in his brother's grave, he thought about it carefully. The earth held heat. Somehow, despite winter's fury above, the earth just a few feet down remained warm. What kept it warm? Where did that heat come from? Tobias finished burying Leander the next morning. He piled stones on the grave to mark it and prevent animals from disturbing it. Then he sat beside the mound of rocks and earth, thinking about temperature. The air was cold. The ground surface was cold. But beneath the surface, the earth was warm. This wasn't a small difference. This was the difference between freezing and not freezing. He tried to remember everything he'd learned about earth and temperature. Root cellars stayed cool in summer and warm in winter. Everyone knew that. Farmers used them to store vegetables because the temperature underground stayed constant. Around 50 degrees, give or take. 50 degrees was cold for summer storage, but 50 degrees was warm for winter survival. A man could survive indefinitely at 50 degrees with minimal clothing and no fire. Tobias had seen earth lodges during his early years in the West. Native tribes built them by constructing a wooden frame and covering it with layers of earth and sod. He'd always thought of them as primitive, inferior to log cabins. But now he reconsidered. Those structures were built partially underground, covered with earth. The people who lived in them survived winters without massive fires. He'd assumed they were simply tougher, more accustomed to cold. But maybe it wasn't toughness. Maybe it was engineering. The earth was insulation. Not just a little insulation, but profound insulation. Several feet of soil between you and the winter air would stop cold more effectively than any wall of logs. And the earth itself held heat that came from deep below, from the sun's energy absorbed over summer months and stored in the thermal mass of the ground. That heat radiated slowly upward through winter. Most of it escaped into the air. But if you lived in the earth, you could capture it. Tobias walked back to the cabin and looked at it with new understanding. This structure was fighting the earth. It sat on top of the ground. exposed to wind on all sides, with only thin, wooden walls between the interior and the outside cold. Every surface was a point of heat loss. The roof lost heat upward, the walls lost heat horizontally, the floor lost heat downward into the frozen surface soil. The cabin was designed to lose heat. What if you built into the earth instead of on top of it? What if the earth itself became your walls? Tobias spent the afternoon sketching ideas in the dirt with a stick. A hole in the ground with a roof over it would flood with the first rain. Water would accumulate. You'd be living in a mud pit. That wouldn't work. But what if you built on a slope, so water drained away? What if you elevated the floor slightly above the surrounding ground level? The more he thought about it, the more problems emerged. A hole in the ground would collapse. Soil wasn't stable enough to form walls without support. You'd need a framework, something to hold the earth in place. Logs, maybe, but arranged differently than a cabin. Not vertical walls, but something that worked with the earth's natural tendency to compress and settle. What shape was strongest? What shape distributed weight most evenly? Tobias rode to the nearest settlement 3 days later to arrange for supplies and to tell people about Leander's death. The settlement wasn't much, just a trading post, a blacksmith, and a dozen scattered homesteads within a few miles. The homesteaders were a mix of Germans, Scandinavians, and displaced Americans from the East, all trying to prove up their claims and survive long enough to own land. Vernon Holcomb ran the trading post. He was a thick man in his 50s who'd come west from Ohio 15 years earlier and had opinions about everything. When Tobias mentioned he was planning to build a new structure, Vernon assumed he meant another cabin. Tobias corrected him. He was going to build underground. Vernon stopped measuring out the nails Tobias had requested and stared at him. "You're going to build what?" Vernon said. "Underground?" Tobias repeated. "Like a root cellar, but large enough to live in. The earth stays warm. I'm going to build into a hillside and cover the whole thing with soil." Vernon set down the nails and laughed. "That's the dumbest thing I've heard this year," he said. "You're going to live in a hole? Like a badger?" Tobias didn't argue. He just asked for the supplies he needed. Canvas, tar paper, additional nails, and iron brackets if Vernon had any. Word spread quickly. By the time Tobias returned to his homestead, Magnus Lindquist had ridden over from his claim 2 miles south. Magnus was a Swede who'd arrived in Dakota Territory 5 years earlier and had survived through a combination of hard work and careful planning. He was younger than Tobias, maybe 28, but he had a reputation for being practical and open-minded. Magnus asked to see Tobias's plans. Tobias showed him the sketches he'd been refining. A dome structure, partially excavated into a hillside, with a wooden frame covered by layers of birch bark, canvas, and earth. The dome shape would distribute weight evenly and prevent collapse. The hillside location would provide drainage and natural insulation from 3 sides. Magnus studied the drawings without speaking for several minutes. "This might work," Magnus finally said. "People build sod houses. This is similar, just more of it underground. How deep are you going?" Tobias explained he was planning to excavate 4 feet down, then build the dome structure up from there, giving him about 7 feet of interior height at the center. The whole thing would be covered with 2 to 3 feet of earth and sod. Magnus nodded slowly. "You're going to need help digging," he said. Tobias's wife, Elspeth, had been staying with her sister in Deadwood since Leander's death. When Tobias rode there to tell her about his plans, she listened in silence. Then she asked the question he'd been dreading. "You want us to live underground, like we're already buried?" Tobias tried to explain the thermal principles, the way Earth holds heat, the structural advantages. Elspeth cut him off. "It sounds like you're building a grave," she said. "You're building a grave for us because your brother died, and you think somehow this will fix it." Tobias returned to his homestead in late April 1887 and began digging. He'd selected a hillside location 50 yards from the creek, on ground that sloped gently southward. The southern exposure would catch maximum sunlight. The slope would ensure drainage. He marked out a circle 20 feet in diameter and started removing soil. The work was brutal. He dug alone for the first week, moving earth one shovelful at a time. The soil was dense prairie clay mixed with rocks and roots from the grass that had grown there for centuries. He worked from dawn until dark, breaking only to eat and rest briefly. His hands developed blisters that burst and reformed as calluses. His back ached constantly. Every shovelful felt like it made no progress. By the end of the first week, he'd excavated roughly 3 feet deep across half the circle. The removed earth formed a growing pile nearby. He would use that soil later to cover the structure, but for now it was just evidence of how much work remained. Other homesteaders rode past occasionally. Most didn't stop. A few shouted comments. "Erdman's digging his own grave. Man's lost his mind. Going to bury himself before winter does it for him." Vernon Holcomb rode out on the 8th day with 2 other men. They sat on their horses watching Tobias dig. Vernon called down to him, "You could build a cabin in the time you're spending on this hole. A good cabin, logs and a roof and a door. Something respectable." Tobias kept digging. He didn't have energy to waste on arguments. Vernon and his companions rode away laughing. Magnus Lindquist showed up on the 10th day with his own shovel. He didn't ask permission or explain why he'd come. He just climbed down into the excavation and started digging. The 2 men worked in silence for most of the morning. Around midday, Magnus finally spoke. "In Sweden, my grandfather built a house partially into a hillside. Not this deep, but the principle was similar. Stone walls built into the earth, sod roof. That house stayed warmer than the wooden houses in the village. Everyone thought my grandfather was strange until they visited in winter." Tobias asked why Magnus was helping. Magnus kept digging. "Because you might be right," he said, "and because when you prove everyone wrong, I want to know how you did it. Also, I don't like Vernon Holcomb." The 2 men continued working. With Magnus helping, the progress doubled. By the end of that day, they'd excavated the full circle to a depth of 4 feet. The bottom was uneven, requiring careful leveling, but the major excavation was complete. Over the next week, Tobias worked alone again, fine-tuning the floor level and cutting a sloped entrance tunnel that would allow access to the underground chamber. The entrance would face south, protected from north winds. He dug it at a gentle angle, creating steps from packed earth, reinforced with flat stones he gathered from the creek bed. The excavation was complete, but the real challenge was just beginning. Tobias needed to build a structure that would support thousands of pounds of earth without collapsing, using materials available on the frontier and skills he'd learned from building simple cabins. He had no training in engineering. He had observation and necessity. He studied shapes in nature. Birds' eggs were thin shells that resisted enormous pressure. Beaver lodges were dome structures that stood for years. Prairie dog mounds were curved tunnels that never collapsed despite being just packed earth. The pattern was clear. Curves distributed weight. Straight walls concentrated stress at corners and joints. A dome would be strongest. Tobias began gathering logs for the frame structure. He needed logs that would curve, which meant younger trees with natural flexibility. He selected cottonwood and willow from the creek bottom, trees with trunks 4 to 6 inches in diameter, too thick and they wouldn't bend, too thin and they wouldn't support the weight. He cut 30 of these logs, each about 16 feet long, and dragged them to the building site. The frame design came together through trial and error. He set up a center post in the middle of the excavated circle, a thick log planted 3 feet deep for stability. This would be the dome's apex, 7 feet above the floor level. From this center point, he would arch the flexible logs outward and down to the perimeter, creating ribs like an upside-down basket. Setting the first rib taught him how difficult this would be. The log wanted to spring back straight. He needed to anchor both ends, the top to the center post and the bottom to the perimeter of the excavation. He used iron brackets at the top, expensive but necessary. At the bottom, he buried the log ends 2 feet into the earth beyond the excavation perimeter, creating anchors the earth itself would hold in place. The first rib stood trembling under tension but holding its curve. Tobias added a second rib opposite the first, balancing the force, then a third and fourth, creating a cross pattern. The structure became more stable with each addition. The ribs supported each other. After installing 8 primary ribs, he added secondary ribs between them, creating a framework of curved wood every 2 feet around the dome's circumference. The result looked delicate, like a skeleton, but when Tobias climbed on it to test the strength, the structure held his weight easily. The force of his weight on one point distributed through the interconnected ribs. This was the principle he'd been seeking: load distribution through curvature. A flat roof had to support weight at every point. A dome converted downward force into outward compression, which the earth itself would resist once the structure was buried. Magnus visited and examined the framework. He walked around it twice before speaking. "This is either brilliant or insane, probably both." "How are you going to cover it?" Tobias explained his plan. "Layers. First birch bark for waterproofing, then canvas treated with tar, then earth, then sod cut from the prairie and laid like shingles. Grass side up. The roots would knit together, creating a living roof that would only get stronger over time. The entrance tunnel required its own structure. Tobias couldn't simply leave an open hole through the earth covering. He needed a frame that would maintain the entrance while supporting the dome above it. He built a rectangular frame from heavy logs, creating a tunnel 4 feet high and 3 feet wide. The frame extended from the south-facing entrance upward at a gentle slope until it met the dome structure at floor level. Getting the dimensions precise took 2 days of careful measurement and adjustment. The entrance had to be low enough that earth could cover it, but high enough that a man could enter without crawling. The slope had to be gentle enough for easy access, but steep enough for water drainage. Tobias cut steps into the packed earth of the entrance tunnel and reinforced them with flat stones mortared with clay. The door would be critical. An underground structure needed an airtight door to maintain stable temperature. Cold air sinking into the entrance would defeat the purpose of earth insulation. Tobias designed a door that would seal completely when closed. He used thick planks fitted tightly together, reinforced with cross braces. The door would swing inward, which seemed counterintuitive, but he'd reasoned through the physics. An inward swinging door could be barred from inside and would seal tighter under external wind pressure. Around the dome's perimeter, Tobias began the laborious work of creating a moisture barrier. Water was the enemy of earth structures. If water penetrated and froze, it would expand and destroy the integrity of the covering. He gathered birch bark from the creek bottom, peeling it from dead trees in large sheets. Birch bark was naturally waterproof, flexible, and durable. He overlapped the sheets like shingles, starting at the bottom of the dome and working upward, each layer covering the seam of the layer below. Securing the birch bark required thousands of small wooden pegs. Tobias spent evening hours whittling these pegs from scrap wood, creating a pile of several hundred. He drove them through the bark into the log framework, pinning the waterproof layer in place. The work was tedious, requiring precise placement to avoid creating leak points. After 5 days, the entire dome was covered in overlapping birch bark. Over the birch bark, he laid canvas he'd purchased from Vernon's trading post. The canvas cost more than Tobias wanted to spend, but it was essential. He treated the canvas with a mixture of pine tar and linseed oil, creating a flexible, waterproof membrane. The tar mixture smelled terrible and stuck to everything, but it sealed the canvas completely. Tobias worked in sections, painting the tar mixture onto the canvas and smoothing it with a wooden paddle until the fabric was saturated. The canvas layer went up faster than the birch bark, taking only 3 days. When finished, the dome structure was covered in a black, slightly shiny membrane that shed water perfectly. Tobias tested it by throwing buckets of water over different sections. The water ran off immediately, following the dome's curve down to the ground. With the waterproof membrane complete, Tobias faced the most physically demanding phase of construction. He needed to cover the entire dome with earth, creating an insulation layer thick enough to maintain stable interior temperature regardless of external conditions. He calculated that 2 to 3 feet of soil would be sufficient. That meant moving approximately 40 tons of earth from his excavation pile onto the dome structure. He started at the bottom, piling soil against the perimeter where the dome met ground level. The earth had to be packed firmly, but not so forcefully that it damaged the waterproof membrane beneath. Tobias used a wooden tamping tool, compressing each layer before adding the next. The work required constant attention to avoid creating air pockets or loose sections that would settle unevenly. The first few feet went relatively quickly. Gravity helped. Soil piled against the lower sections of the dome wanted to stay in place. But as Tobias worked higher, approaching the dome's curve, the earth wanted to slide downward. He solved this by creating terraces, building up the earth in horizontal layers that stepped inward as they rose. Each terrace was packed solid before he added the next layer above it. After 2 weeks of moving soil, the dome was covered to a depth of 18 inches across most of its surface. The structure had transformed from a skeletal frame to a substantial mound. Tobias walked around it, checking for settling or weak spots. The earth covering had compressed the canvas and birch bark layers beneath, but the log framework held firm. No sagging, no structural compromise. Magnus visited and brought his wife Karen to see the progress. She walked around the mound slowly, then asked where the door was. Tobias showed her the entrance tunnel, still uncovered, leading into darkness beneath the earth. Karen peered into the entrance but didn't enter. She turned to Magnus and spoke in Swedish. Magnus translated. She says it looks like a burial mound. She wants to know if you've built this for the living or the dead. Tobias had no answer that would satisfy someone who saw only a grave. He returned to work, adding more earth. By the end of the 3rd week of covering, he'd achieved a consistent depth of 2 feet across the entire dome, except for the apex, where he deliberately kept the earth thinner. To accommodate the chimney, he would install later. The entrance tunnel received special attention. Tobias built up earth around and over the log frame, creating a covered passage that descended into the mound. He left the entrance itself open, a dark rectangular doorway facing south. The contrast was stark. Bright prairie sunlight outside, absolute darkness within. Anyone approaching would see only a black opening into a hill, nothing to indicate this was a dwelling rather than an animal den. Vernon Holcomb rode past with 2 companions. They stopped to stare. Vernon called out loudly enough for Tobias to hear clearly. "Man's building his own tomb, going to seal himself in there and suffocate. Mark my words, we'll be digging him out come spring." Dead and frozen in his badger hole. The earth covering provided insulation and thermal mass, but it was vulnerable. Rain would erode it. Wind would scatter loose soil. Tobias needed a protective layer that would hold everything in place and improve the structure's weatherproofing. The solution was living sod, cut from the prairie and laid over the earth mound like armor made from grass roots and soil. Cutting sod was an art. Tobias had watched homesteaders cut sod bricks for sod houses, but this application was different. For a sod house, you needed thick, rectangular bricks that could be stacked like masonry. For covering a dome, he needed thinner pieces that could conform to the curved surface. He developed a technique using a sharp spade, cutting sections roughly 2 feet long, 1 foot wide, and 3 inches thick. Each piece weighed approximately 30 pounds. The grass roots formed a mat that held the soil together. Tobias selected areas where buffalo grass grew thickest, knowing those roots would be strongest. He cut the sod in a pattern, leaving strips of living grass between his cuts so the prairie would recover. He loaded the cut pieces onto a travois pulled by his horse and hauled them to the construction site. Laying the sod required starting at the bottom and working upward in overlapping rows, like shingling a roof. Each piece was positioned with the grass side up and the soil side pressed firmly against the earth covering beneath. The roots from each piece would grow downward into the earth mound and sideways into adjacent pieces, creating an interwoven network that would eventually bind the entire surface into a unified mass. Tobias worked methodically, maintaining consistent overlap to prevent gaps where water could penetrate. The physical labor was exhausting. Carrying 30-pound sod pieces up the curved surface of the mound, positioning them precisely, then returning for the next piece. He cut and placed approximately 200 pieces over 5 days, covering the entire dome except for the apex where the chimney would penetrate. As he worked, the structure transformed again. The dark earth mound became covered in golden prairie grass. From a distance, it looked like a natural hill. Only the entrance tunnel, with its dark rectangular opening, indicated human construction. Birds began landing on the grass, covering almost immediately, pecking for seeds. Within days, grasshoppers had moved in. The sod was alive, actively growing. Rain came on the 6th day after Tobias finished laying the sod. He watched anxiously, checking for erosion or water penetration. The sod absorbed the rain like a sponge. The grass bent but held its position. Water that didn't soak in ran down the dome's curve in sheets, following the contour to the ground. No erosion, no loose soil washing away. The living roof was performing exactly as he'd hoped. Magnus visited after the rain and examined the sod covering. He pressed his boot against the surface, testing its firmness. "It feels solid," he said, "like real ground, not like something built." Tobias explained that in another month the roots would be fully integrated. The dome would effectively have a skin of living grass, protecting it from weather, temperature extremes, and physical damage. An underground dwelling without proper ventilation would become a death trap. Smoke from a fire needed an escape route, but the chimney also had to prevent cold air from sinking into the structure and had to resist blockage from snow or debris. Tobias spent several nights sketching designs, trying to solve a problem that had no precedent in frontier construction. Standard cabin chimneys were simple: a vertical passage from fireplace to roof, usually built from stone or mud brick. They worked adequately but had persistent problems: downdrafts when wind blew across the top, backdraft when fires were first lit, ice formation in winter that restricted airflow. For a chimney penetrating through several feet of earth and sod, these problems would be magnified. Tobias's solution came from observing how root cellars stayed ventilated. The few well-designed root cellars he'd seen had 2 openings, one low for cool air intake and one high for warm air exhaust. The temperature difference created natural circulation without requiring mechanical assistance. He could apply the same principle to his chimney design, creating a system that would draw air upward through the fireplace and exhaust it efficiently. He designed a double pipe arrangement. The inner pipe would be the actual flue, carrying smoke from the fireplace. The outer pipe, separated by a 3-inch gap, would be a secondary passage. Cold air entering at the top would descend through this gap, warming as it passed the hot inner flue, then enter the dwelling at floor level. This would prevent cold downdrafts while providing fresh air circulation. Building the chimney required materials Tobias didn't have. Metal pipe would be ideal, but was prohibitively expensive. He compromised by using clay tiles he formed himself from creek clay mixed with sand and straw. He shaped the tiles in sections around a wooden form, creating cylindrical pieces that would stack to form the chimney. Each tile was roughly 8 inches in diameter for the inner flue and 14 inches for the outer casing. The tiles had to dry slowly to prevent cracking. Tobias built a covered drying area and spent 2 weeks forming and drying enough tiles to construct a chimney 12 feet tall, which would extend from the fireplace through the earth, covering and 4 feet above the dome's surface. He fired the tiles in a temporary kiln he built from stones and mud, heating them gradually to harden the clay. Installing the chimney required cutting through the waterproof membrane at the dome's apex, a moment that worried Tobias considerably. Any leak at this point would allow water directly into the structure. He cut the opening precisely, making it just large enough for the outer chimney casing. He installed the inner flue first, starting from the fireplace location inside the dome and working upward through the earth. The double pipe system assembled successfully. Tobias sealed the penetration through the waterproof membrane with layers of tar-soaked canvas, building up a waterproof collar around the chimney. Above the sod layer, the chimney extended as a clay column 4 feet high, capped with a stone slab supported by small brackets to keep rain out while allowing smoke to escape horizontally. September 1887 brought the first hints of autumn to Dakota Territory. The grass turned from green to gold. Nights grew cold enough to show breath. Tobias finished the interior work on his underground dwelling and rode to Deadwood to bring Elspeth home. She came reluctantly, her face showing resignation rather than enthusiasm. Their few possessions fit into a single wagon. The entrance confronted them as an architectural challenge and a psychological barrier. Elspeth stood before the dark rectangular opening cut into the hillside, gripping her shawl tightly. She didn't speak, but Tobias understood her hesitation. Eureka! Instinct said that descending into darkness beneath tons of earth was dangerous, unnatural, wrong. He lit a lantern and led the way down the sloped entrance tunnel. The interior was smaller than their cabin had been. The circular floor space was 20 feet in diameter, giving roughly 300 square feet of living area. The domed ceiling rose to 7 feet at the center, sloping down to 5 feet at the perimeter. Tobias had built a raised sleeping platform along one side, a work table, and shelves carved into the earth walls and reinforced with boards. The fireplace occupied the north side, its opening framed with stones. Elspeth set down the basket she carried and turned slowly, taking in the space. The walls were packed earth, smooth where Tobias had carved them, rough where natural soil showed through. The floor was hard-packed clay that he'd mixed with lime to create a durable surface. Small gunport windows, just 6 inches tall and 12 inches wide, were cut through the earth at ground level on the south side, allowing thin strips of light to enter. With the lantern providing the only substantial illumination, the space felt cave-like, enclosed, protected, or imprisoned depending on perspective. She asked about cooking, about smoke, about whether they would suffocate in their sleep. Tobias demonstrated the chimney system by lighting a small fire. The smoke drew upward immediately, pulled by the draft he'd engineered. He showed her the air circulation, how cool air entered through the chimney's outer passage and warm air exhausted through the inner flue. The system worked exactly as designed. Over the following days, Elspeth made the space livable. She hung fabric partitions to create separate areas for sleeping and living. She arranged their few pieces of furniture to maximize the limited space. She placed their dishes on the shelves Tobias had built. Slowly, the underground chamber transformed from a construction project into a home. But she never stopped referring to it as the hole or the cave, never calling it a house. The first night sleeping underground was strange for both of them. The silence was profound. No wind sounds, no creaking logs, no animal noises from outside, just absolute quiet and darkness when the lantern was extinguished. The temperature was comfortable without any fire. The air felt still but not stale. Tobias slept soundly. Elspeth lay awake for hours, feeling the weight of earth above them, thinking about burial, about Leander frozen in the cabin, about whether her husband's obsession had created safety or a tomb. Morning brought a revelation that began changing her perspective. When Tobias opened the entrance door, cold air rushed in. The temperature inside had been comfortable enough to sleep without heavy blankets. Outside, frost covered the ground. December brought Dakota Territory's characteristic brutal cold. Temperatures dropped to 20 below zero and stayed there for days. Wind swept across the open prairie with nothing to slow it. Every homesteader retreated indoors, burning wood constantly, venturing out only when absolutely necessary. This was the season that tested all structures and killed the unprepared. Vernon Holcomb's cabin was typical frontier construction: good logs, proper chinked, solid roof. He'd built it 4 years earlier and maintained it well. But during the cold snap, Vernon found himself burning wood at an alarming rate. He fed his fireplace every 30 minutes through the day and woke twice each night to add more fuel. The interior temperature stayed barely tolerable, perhaps 55 degrees near the fire, dropping to 40 in the corners. His wife and 3 children huddled close to the fireplace, wearing layers of clothing indoors. Frost formed on the interior walls every morning. The single window was covered with a quilt, but cold air leaked around the frame. The door, despite being tightly fitted, allowed a constant draft across the floor. Vernon calculated his wood consumption and realized with growing concern that he might not have enough to last until spring if this cold continued. 2 miles away, Tobias's underground dwelling maintained 62 degrees with minimal heating. He burned a small fire each evening, more for cooking and light than for warmth. The thermal mass of earth surrounding the structure absorbed heat slowly during the day and released it gradually through the night. The temperature fluctuation from day to night was perhaps 3 degrees. The cold outside was irrelevant. Elspeth had stopped complaining about living underground. The comfort was undeniable. She could work at the table without wearing a heavy coat. Their daughter, who had been born in October, slept peacefully without the excessive bundling required in a cold cabin. Laundry hung to dry inside, actually dried rather than freezing stiff. The contrast between their comfort and what Elspeth remembered of winter in the cabin was profound. Magnus Lindquist visited during the cold snap, riding over despite the dangerous temperature. He came inside, removed his heavy coat, and stood in the center of the space looking around with obvious amazement. "It's warm," he said, stating the obvious because the reality contradicted his expectations. "You're not even burning wood right now." Tobias showed him the thermal principle. The earth temperature 4 feet below the surface stayed constant around 50 degrees. The structure was insulated by several feet of soil. The sod covering prevented heat loss. The curved design minimized surface area. The system worked with physics rather than fighting it. Magnus asked detailed questions about construction costs, time investment, and whether the structure would last. Tobias explained that he'd spent approximately 3 months of labor and perhaps $30 in materials, mostly for iron hardware and canvas. A cabin took less time but required constant wood consumption to remain habitable in winter. His structure required almost no ongoing expense. As for longevity, the earth would only settle and compress over time, making it stronger. Before Magnus left, he asked if Tobias would help him build a similar structure in the spring. Tobias agreed immediately. The vindication was quiet but real. One person believing him was enough. March 1888 arrived with weather that confused experienced frontiersmen. Warm days pushed temperatures into the 50s, melting snow and creating false hope that spring had truly arrived. Then, sudden cold fronts would drop temperatures back below freezing overnight. The pattern repeated weekly, creating cycles of thaw and freeze that were unusual even for Dakota Territory's unpredictable climate. Old-timers in the settlement talked about the weather patterns with growing unease. Jacob Reinhold, a German immigrant who'd survived 20 Dakota winters, told anyone who would listen that something unprecedented was building. He'd seen changeable weather before, but never this extreme oscillation, warm air masses from the south colliding with Arctic air from the north. The atmosphere felt unstable, pressurized, ready to release something catastrophic. Tobias paid attention to these warnings. He checked his chimney system carefully, ensuring no ice had formed in the flue and that the draw was strong. He inspected the sod covering for any winter damage and found none. The grass had gone dormant, but the root system remained intact. He reinforced the entrance door, adding leather seals around the frame to make it even more airtight. He stockpiled firewood inside the entrance tunnel, enough for 2 weeks if needed. Vernon Holcomb, exhausted from a winter of constant wood burning and still skeptical of Tobias's underground dwelling, made no special preparations. His cabin had survived 4 winters. It would survive another late-season storm if one came. Most homesteaders shared this attitude. March. Storms were common but rarely catastrophic. You weathered them and moved on. On March 10th, the temperature reached 58 degrees. Children played outside without coats. Men worked in shirt sleeves, repairing winter damage to outbuildings. The sky was clear, the wind calm. By sunset, the temperature had dropped to 35 degrees. Not unusual, not alarming, just another Dakota Territory temperature swing. That night, lying in the comfortable darkness of his earth-sheltered home, Tobias couldn't sleep. Something felt wrong. The air pressure had changed. His ears felt the difference even underground. Elspeth asked what was bothering him. He couldn't articulate it clearly, just a feeling that the weather was about to do something terrible. At dawn on March 11th, the sky was gray and low. The temperature had dropped to 22 degrees overnight. Wind had picked up from the north, steady and cold. By mid-morning, the temperature was 18 degrees and falling. The wind increased. By noon, snow began falling, not gently but horizontally, driven by wind that was strengthening with every hour. Tobias stood at his entrance, watching the deteriorating conditions. This wasn't a normal March storm. The wind velocity was already beyond anything he'd experienced. The snow wasn't accumulating so much as being sculpted by the wind into drifts that formed and reformed constantly. Visibility was decreasing rapidly. He closed the entrance door and barred it securely. Whatever was coming, they would wait it out underground. By 2 in the afternoon, the wind was screaming across the prairie with sustained velocity that Tobias estimated at 40 miles per hour. The temperature had dropped to 8 degrees. The world outside had disappeared into white chaos. The blizzard intensified through the afternoon of March 11th with a ferocity that exceeded every previous storm in living memory. Wind speeds reached sustained velocities of 50 miles per hour with gusts substantially higher. Snow fell so thickly that visibility dropped to 0. A man couldn't see his hand extended at arm's length. The temperature continued falling, reaching 10 below 0 by late afternoon. Inside Vernon Holcomb's cabin, the family gathered close to the fireplace. Vernon fed wood constantly, burning through his carefully rationed supply faster than planned because the cabin couldn't hold heat against this wind. Cold air infiltrated through every gap in the log construction. The windows, covered with quilts, still leaked frigid air around the frames. The door shuddered against its hinges with each wind gust. Snow found its way through invisible cracks, creating small drifts inside along the floor. The children huddled under blankets. Vernon's wife, Sarah, heated stones in the fireplace and wrapped them in cloth for the children to hold. The interior temperature, despite the roaring fire, was perhaps 45 degrees near the hearth and 30 degrees in the corners. Frost formed on the interior walls. Their breath showed as vapor. This wasn't survival comfort. This was endurance. The wind made sounds against the cabin that Vernon had never heard before. Not just howling, but percussion, as gusts struck the walls with physical force. The roof creaked ominously. Snow was accumulating on the roof faster than wind could clear it. The weight was becoming substantial. Vernon looked up at the ceiling boards and wondered how much weight they could support before failing. Underground, Tobias heard the storm only as a distant, muted roar, like standing behind a waterfall. The earth absorbed and dampened the sound. Inside the dwelling, the temperature was 60 degrees. Elspeth prepared a simple dinner. Their daughter played on the floor. unconcerned with the catastrophe raging 30 feet above them. The lantern light was steady, the air comfortable, the fire in the fireplace small and mainly decorative. Tobias had cut the small gunport windows at ground, level thinking they would provide light and fresh air. Now they were completely buried under snow. No light entered. The chimney continued drawing air properly, maintaining ventilation. The door was buried too, drifted over within hours of the storm's start. They were sealed underground, but unlike a tomb, this seal was protective. The snow above them was adding insulation. The wind couldn't touch them. The cold couldn't reach them. As darkness fell on March 11th, the storm showed no sign of diminishing. The wind increased. The temperature continued dropping, reaching 20 below zero by midnight. Across Dakota Territory, people were dying, caught between buildings, trapped in inadequate shelters, frozen in their own homes when fires went out or wood supplies were exhausted. Magnus Lindquist's cabin, built more carefully than most, was holding together but barely. He'd moved his wife and children into a single corner and built a wind barrier from furniture and blankets, creating a small protected space around the fireplace. They would survive, but the experience was harrowing. The storm intensified through the night of March 11th into a phenomenon that would be remembered as the Great Blizzard of 1888. Wind speeds exceeded 60 miles per hour in sustained bursts. The temperature dropped to 42 degrees below zero. Snow fell continuously, driven horizontally with such force that it felt like sand against exposed skin. The combination of wind, snow, and extreme cold created conditions incompatible with human survival. Vernon Holcomb's cabin began failing around midnight. The wind pressure had been constant for 12 hours, pushing against the northern wall with unrelenting force. The logs were solid, but the chinking between them was old and cracking. The gaps widened under the stress. Cold air poured through in streams. Vernon stuffed rags into the gaps, but there were too many. The interior temperature dropped to 35 degrees despite the fire-consuming wood faster than he'd believed possible. At 2 in the morning, part of the roof gave way. Not a catastrophic collapse, but a section near the chimney where snow weight had accumulated heavily. The ceiling boards cracked, and snow poured through into the cabin. Vernon moved his family away from the breach, consolidating them into the opposite corner. He tried to patch the opening with a blanket and boards, but the damage was done. The cabin was compromised. Sarah Holcomb wrapped their children in every piece of fabric they owned. The youngest child, a girl of 4, was crying from cold. The older children, 2 boys aged 7 and 9, stayed silent and scared. Vernon kept the fire burning, but the heat was escaping through the roof breach faster than wood could replace it. He looked at his woodpile and made a calculation that terrified him. They had perhaps 6 hours of fuel remaining. Across the territory, similar disasters were unfolding. Cabins, lost roofs, chimneys collapsed, filling interiors with smoke and forcing families to extinguish fires or suffocate. Doors were torn from hinges by wind pressure. People made desperate decisions, trying to reach neighbors or town and dying in drifts within yards of shelter. The storm was indiscriminate and merciless. Underground, Tobias listened to the muffled roar above and felt the structure settle slightly as snow weight accumulated on the sod covering. He calculated the load. Several feet of snow compressed by wind represented tons of weight distributed across the dome. The structure's curved design distributed that weight evenly. No single point bore concentrated stress. The log framework creaked occasionally but held firm. The earth covering, compressed by snow weight, actually became denser and provided better insulation. Elspeth asked if they were safe. Tobias explained the physics with confidence he genuinely felt. The dome shape was strongest under even loading. Snow provided additional insulation. The earth protected them from wind. The chimney continued drawing properly. They were safe. More than safe. They were comfortable. While the worst blizzard in American history raged outside, They sat in shirt sleeves in their underground home, warm and secure and completely isolated from the catastrophe above. The disconnect between their reality and what was happening 30 feet above them was so profound that Elspeth struggled to accept it. How could they be comfortable while people were dying? The storm continued without pause through March 12th and into March 13th. Wind that had seemed impossible to sustain maintained its violence for 48 hours straight. Snow accumulation reached depths that would have been dismissed as exaggeration if they hadn't been carefully measured afterward. Drifts in some areas exceeded 15 feet. The landscape was completely reshaped. Tobias marked time by the clock he'd brought from the cabin. Without windows, without natural light, the underground dwelling existed in a timeless state. He maintained routines to give structure to their confinement. Meals at regular hours, sleep at normal times, activities to keep their minds occupied. Elspeth read from the 2 books they owned. Tobias worked on carving wooden spoons from scrap lumber. Their daughter slept peacefully through most of the ordeal. The chimney system proved its worth during these days. Despite the extraordinary snow accumulation above, the 4-foot extension above the dome kept the chimney opening clear. The design prevented backdraft even in severe wind. The double pipe arrangement maintained fresh air circulation. At no point did they experience smoke issues or stale air. The engineering Tobias had obsessed over was functioning perfectly under the worst possible test. On March 13th, the temperature outside reached 48 below zero, the coldest reading of the entire event. Inside the earth-sheltered dwelling, the temperature had dropped slightly to 58 degrees. The thermal mass of Earth was losing heat to the extreme cold above, but slowly. The insulation value of several feet of soil combined with snow covering meant the heat loss was gradual. Even without any fire, the interior would take weeks to cool to dangerous levels. Vernon Holcomb's situation had become desperate. His woodpile was exhausted by the morning of March 13th. The fire died. Within 2 hours, the interior temperature dropped to 20 degrees. Within 4 hours, it was 5 degrees. The cabin had become a trap. Snow blocked the door and window. The roof breach allowed wind to circulate through the interior. The family huddled together under every blanket, sharing body heat, slowly freezing. Vernon made the decision to abandon the cabin and try reaching Tobias's underground dwelling. He knew approximately where it was, perhaps a quarter-mile south. In normal conditions, an easy walk. In current conditions, almost certainly fatal. But staying meant certain death. He told Sarah his plan. She argued against it, but weakly. She knew they had no choice. Vernon wrapped himself in layers, covered his face with cloth, and forced open the door. Snow had drifted against it 6 feet deep. He dug through and emerged into conditions that stopped him immediately. The wind physically pushed him backward. He couldn't see anything. Not the ground, not the sky. Just white in every direction. He took 5 steps from the cabin, trying to orient himself southward, and immediately lost sight of his own door. He retreated to the cabin. The attempt had lasted less than 2 minutes. He was already dangerously cold. His hands were numb despite gloves. His face hurt where wind had struck exposed skin. Moving a quarter-mile in these conditions was impossible. They were trapped. March 14th brought the first signs that the storm was weakening. The wind decreased from sustained fury to intermittent gusts. The snow stopped falling around midday. By afternoon, the sun appeared through thinning clouds, weak but present. The temperature remained brutally cold, 20 below zero. But the wind's absence made the cold bearable rather than lethal. Tobias heard the change. The muted roar above them faded to silence. He waited several hours to ensure the storm was truly finished, then began the work of digging out. The entrance tunnel was completely buried under packed snow. He started from inside, working upward and outward with a shovel, moving snow 1 load at a time. The work was slow and exhausting. After 3 hours of digging, he broke through to daylight. The sun was blinding after 3 days underground. He climbed out onto a transformed landscape. Snow covered everything to depths he'd never seen. His earth-sheltered dwelling was invisible under the white expanse. Only the chimney protruded, a thin column of clay showing where the structure existed beneath. The surrounding prairie had become a featureless white desert, sculpted into drifts and waves by 3 days of violent wind. Tobias looked toward where Vernon Holcomb's cabin should be visible. He saw nothing. Either the cabin was buried completely under snow or it was gone. He grabbed his shovel and started walking, breaking trail through hip-deep snow. The distance that should have taken minutes required nearly an hour. When he reached Vernon's location, he found the cabin still standing but severely damaged. Part of the roof had collapsed. The door hung open, snow drifted inside. He called out. No response. He climbed through the entrance and found the family huddled in the corner, alive but hypothermic. They had survived 3 days with no heat in temperatures that should have killed them. Vernon looked up at Tobias with eyes that barely registered recognition. Tobias knew they had perhaps hours before hypothermia became fatal. He ran back to his dwelling and returned with Magnus Lindquist, who had emerged from his own damaged cabin. Together they carried Vernon's family through the snow to the underground structure. The children were nearly unconscious from cold. Sarah was shivering violently, unable to speak. Vernon could barely walk. Inside the earth-sheltered dwelling, the warmth was immediate and profound. Elspeth wrapped the children in blankets and placed heated stones around them. Magnus built up the fire. Within an hour, the shivering stopped. Within 2 hours, the children were drinking warm broth. Vernon sat near the fire, looking around the underground space that he had mocked as a grave. He didn't speak, but his expression showed the complete reversal of his understanding. This structure had saved his family's life. Over the next week, as settlers emerged from damaged homes and counted their losses, the death toll became clear. 47 people had died in their section of Dakota Territory. Some froze in transit between buildings. Others died in inadequate shelters. 3 entire families perished. The spring of 1888 brought survivors together to rebuild and reconsider how they lived on the frontier. Vernon Holcomb's cabin required complete reconstruction. Magnus Lindquist's cabin needed a new roof and extensive repairs. Virtually every structure in the territory had suffered damage, except one. Tobias Erdmann's earth-sheltered dwelling had weathered the worst blizzard in American history without sustaining any damage whatsoever. Word spread quickly through homesteader networks. A man had built underground and survived in comfort, while others had nearly frozen. The details seemed impossible until people visited and saw for themselves. The structure looked like a natural hill. The interior was warm, dry, and structurally sound. The engineering was simple enough that anyone could replicate it with time and effort. Magnus Lindquist was the first to ask Tobias for help building a similar structure. Then Vernon Holcomb, humbled by his near-death experience, asked to learn the technique. By June of 1888, Tobias was helping 3 families excavate sites and build earth-sheltered dwellings. He shared every detail of his design freely: the curved dome framework, the waterproofing layers, the sod covering, the chimney system. Nothing was secret. The structures took longer to build than conventional cabins, but the winter protection they offered made the time investment worthwhile. By the fall of 1888, 7 earth-sheltered dwellings existed in the territory. By 1890, that number had grown to 23. Settlers called them Erdmann shelters, though Tobias never claimed the name or tried to profit from his innovation. The practical advantages became clear over subsequent winters. Erdmann shelters required minimal firewood. They maintained stable temperatures regardless of external conditions. They were invisible to hostile raiders who might target cabins. They lasted decades without major repairs. The grass covering prevented erosion and required no maintenance. The structures aged gracefully, becoming more stable as earth settled and compressed over time. Tobias and Elspeth lived in their underground home for 12 years. They raised 3 children there. In 1900, as Dakota Territory transitioned toward statehood and towns grew larger, they moved to a frame house in a developing settlement. But they kept the earth-sheltered dwelling maintained, using it as storage and occasionally as shelter during severe storms. The original structure Tobias built in 1887 survived into the early 20th century. Later, homesteaders used it as a way station. During the drought years of the 1930s, families took shelter there when their own homes became uninhabitable. The grass-covered mound gradually eroded, the dome framework eventually collapsed, but the principles Tobias had proven remained valid and valuable. Modern historians studying frontier survival techniques recognize the earth-sheltered dwelling as a significant innovation in American homesteading. The design solved fundamental problems of heat retention, structural durability, and resource efficiency using only materials available on the prairie and labor-intensive construction methods. Lives were saved not through superior weapons or toughness, but through better engineering. Tobias Erdmann died in 1926 at age 71. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his years as a homesteader, but made no reference to the dwelling that had saved his family and inspired dozens of others to build similar structures. To most people, he was simply another early settler who had survived and prospered. But among the families whose ancestors had built Erdmann shelters, the story persisted. The man who dug into a hillside and proved that sometimes the best way to survive above ground was to live below it.